Hi, Year Nines. I hope you're all doing well. What we're going to start off with this week is just a quick gap fill activity to test what you learned in last week's lessons. Now, last week for history in your 2 hours, you should have looked at the Kaiser's three main problems and how he dealt with them. Now, if for some reason you haven't done that work, please do go back and complete that first. And then once you've done it, I want you to have a go at this quick gap fill activity. You don't need to write down the whole paragraph, just write down which words go in which order, and on the next slide you can check it. Okay, so I'm just going to read through the gap fill activity and I'm going to say verbally the answers that you should have got, and then you can just check as we go through. Okay, so the first one, the Kaiser had wanted to make Germany rich and powerful. He hoped to achieve this through industrialisation. He thought that by doing this, he'd be able to rival the wealth and status of Britain. Although this benefited many rich businessmen, it made life worse for many working class Germans. Conditions in these factories were horrendous. As a result, many people joined, and it should be trade unions, and organised strikes. They also started to support the Socialist Party, who promised equality. This was a real threat because 1 in 3 people supported this party. This was very difficult for the Kaiser to deal with because he needed to crush the socialists, but he couldn't risk a rebellion. He found himself passing limited social reforms, such as the Workers' Protection Act. However, this didn't go far enough. He then tried to distract the people by creating a large empire, something that he could be proud of. So we've now gone through and used all those words. Just double check that you understand what we mean by this paragraph. So main thing to highlight on this slide here is about webinars. Now, I'm sure you've already had something through from Mr. Crossley about what's going to go on with these, but essentially each week we're going to be available on Teams for you for an hour, so that if you've got any questions about the work, if there's anything you're stuck on, if there's anything that you want us to go through in a little bit more detail, you can ask it. Nobody will know who's asked what question apart from me, and I won't say who's asked what, but what I'll do is I'll then answer your questions verbally to make sure that you understand the content. So we need to write down our title for today, which is What did the Kaiser do to cause World War One? Now, ideally, this would be great if you could do this on some lined paper, because we're going to give you a folder when we come back that we're going to put everything into. But if you don't have any lined paper, then just do it in your history exercise book. So you can see today we're obviously trying to look at the Kaiser's foreign policy, what he did to cause World War One. We're going to particularly look at 2 things. One of them is called Weltpolitik, and the other one is called the naval laws. So one of the things that we're going to be looking at today is about the Kaiser's need to build a large navy to rival Britain's. Now, what I want you to do first of all is just think about, why would the Kaiser, why would this King of Germany, want to build a larger navy? What would be the purpose of it? So just have a think, jot down a couple of ideas. I'm going to give you a little bit of time to do that, and then you can compare to what I've got on the next slide afterwards. Okay, so there are many reasons why the Kaiser wanted to build up the large navy. Now, one of them you might remember from the video that we watched in the first lesson about the Kaiser's childhood. So first of all, he was really jealous of the British Navy. He grew up looking at it and he saw that it brought great wealth and status to Britain, and he wanted something similar, especially as he felt the need to prove himself through a big military or a large navy. Now, the next reason is that he really wanted a large navy for his empire. Now, if you're going to build up an empire and you're going to create colonies, which is areas that you control in other countries, you need to make sure that you can actually protect it and also have lots of ships to be able to send your troops to go and colonize it in the first place. So this is really, really important to create an empire, but also to protect it afterwards. Not only that, but it's really important to defend your own country as well. So another reason why the Navy is important is defence. So you want to make sure that you can protect yourself and your country from attack at sea and from invasion. So your Navy is really, really crucial to that. And lastly, you also want to be able to protect your trading ships and your merchant ships as well. So you have to make sure that all the goods that you get from your colonies, from your empire, are transported safely from that nation to your own nation, and therefore you need a large navy for trade protection. So nice simple task, just going to give you a few seconds to look at this map and try and work out what you think it's a map of. So obviously you can clearly see that there's some areas that have been shaded in this kind of orangey red colour. So just have a little think about what those areas might be. Why are they all in the same colour? So as you can see here, this is actually a map of the British Empire in 1899. Now, when you look at it here, you can see how sizable the British Empire was. There was actually a common saying that people said at the time about the sun never sets on the British Empire, because even when it's nighttime in places like Britain, actually it's daytime in places like Australia. So people were really jealous of the size of the British Empire. There were lots of other nations that really wanted to achieve the same thing. And at this time in the early 1900s, there's a lot of countries scrambling for Africa and trying to take as many different nations within Africa as possible. And we're going to see that Germany was also interested in doing that when we look at the next slide. Now you've seen the size of the large British Empire on the last picture on the map from 1899. You can see here the same year, this is what Germany controlled at that point. So you can see that they control various places within Africa. So we've got places like Togo, we've got Cameroon, and we've got something that at the time was called Southwest Africa, but now it's Namibia, which we can see at the bottom there. And we mentioned before that there was a scramble for Africa where loads of European nations thought that they had the right to be able to go and take over lots of African nations. Now, they didn't only have land in Africa, they also had land in what is now Papua New Guinea, but at this time, because it had been colonised by him, it was called Kaiser Wilhelm Land. Very original title, I know. Now, this is actually not named after Wilhelm II, who we've been studying. It's named after his dad, because his dad had been the one to colonise it. So what I'd like you to do now with this information and the information on the previous slide is to answer the question in your books, how did the German Empire compare to the British Empire in 1899? So you're going to want to put down about how the Kaiser was jealous. You're going to want to include some information from this purple box at the top here. And you're probably going to want to name some of the colonies that the Kaiser had as well. So what we'll look at now is something called Weltpolitik, which translates as world policy. Now, as we've already seen from the maps, Britain had a really extensive empire at this point. However, it wasn't the only European nation to have a large and significant empire. Other countries like France and Portugal had made a lot of money from their empires as well. Now, the Kaiser believed that this had been really unfair and that actually Germany should also be able to gain the wealth and status of a large empire and that they should have this empire abroad too. So he decided that he wanted to transform Germany into a global power with control over countries in different parts of the world. So this policy and idea is known as Weltpolitik. So Weltpolitik was this aggressive foreign policy that the Kaiser pursued. Now, what I'd like you to do is to answer two questions in your books or on your paper about this information. The first one is that I want you to define Weltpolitik using the information on this slide. And once you've done that, you need to do the slightly harder task of thinking, why would the Kaiser need a larger navy to help him achieve Weltpolitik? Now, bear in mind that on one of the starter slides, when I talked about why would you need a large navy, I have gone through some of the ideas to help you with this. So try and have a go. Why do you think the Kaiser would need a large navy to be able to go and create an empire? Okay, so you've now seen what Weltpolitik was. You've got a definition in your books. We need to add a few more notes to be able to make sure that we're ready for any exam questions that come up on this. So I'm going to talk through the notes that are on this slide here, and then once I've done that, I'd like you to make notes on them in your books or just copy them out into your books. Okay, so first of all, we can see that Wilhelm believed it was time for Germany to have a place in the sun. Now, you might remember me saying earlier that people used to say about the British Empire that the sun never sets on it. Essentially, it was so big that it just dominated the world. So Wilhelm actually said in an interview with a British newspaper, I want a place in the sun. So he wanted what Britain had, and he wasn't afraid of showing it. Now, we've already mentioned that he particularly focused on Africa. Now, at this time, we get something called the Scramble for Africa that was going on, which we can see has been depicted in this cartoon, where all these different European nations are all trying to pull Africa towards them and take over it. Now, he'd already gained colonies like Cameroon, but he wanted even more. Now, he saw this as something that was going to really help him, taking over all these different nations, gaining this big empire. He thought that it was going to be really good for Germany and that it would gain him lots of support with the German people. So remember, at this time, he's got problems of industrialization and socialism. He's got, all these people going on strikes, these powerful trade unions. And he thinks that if he can actually have this powerful empire, he'll distract them. People will think that he's a great leader because he's made Germany so powerful, and therefore it's going to help him out in a couple of ways. However, to achieve Weltpolitik, a large navy and army were needed. Now, that's because they have to try and make sure that they can, first of all, colonise those areas. So they have to send lots of troops over using the navy to go to that area and colonise it. But also they then need to be able to protect it and send supplies to it and take supplies from those colonies back to their own countries as well. Now, the problem with all of this, and the problem with the Kaiser deciding that he wants a big empire, is it upsets the balance of power in Europe. Essentially, other nations like Britain and France get really paranoid about the fact that Germany is increasing the size of their empire and their navy. They say, why would you need that? And it threatens them, and they actually end up creating all of these alliances, which you might remember from Year 8, that essentially create tensions that then lead to World War I. So in a roundabout way, this policy of Weltpolitik and expanding his empire is actually one of the long-term causes of the First World War, which is something that kills 10 million people. So this is a really significant policy, and I'd like you to make some notes on that. So you've learnt about the Kaiser's aggressive foreign policy and that he needs a navy to be able to achieve his ambition of creating this massive empire. So let's have a little look at the naval laws. So we've got some information here which I need you to carefully read through and then answer those questions at the bottom. So the questions that you need to answer based on this information is, who was it that convinced the Kaiser to build up the navy? Then you also need to think about, were Germany very open about their naval building programme, and why or why weren't they? So you're going to need to think about it and use the information that's in this section here. And then lastly, you have to explain, could Germany afford to build up their navy the way they did? And you'll find that at the end of the information. So make sure you do this in full sentences for me, please. So what we're going to do now is we're just going to go through the answers that you should already have in your books, just to make sure that we've all got the correct ones. So the first one says, who was it that convinced the Kaisers to build up the navy? And it was this man that we can see in the bottom corner here, a man called Admiral Alfred von Tirpitz. Now, it's really important that we have his name in your books because he sometimes comes up in exam questions, but don't worry about those yet because we'll go through all that kind of stuff when we're back together in September. So, question number 2 is, were Germany open about their naval building programme? Why or why not? The answer is that they weren't open about it. They did this in secret, and they did it in secret really because of Britain. Now, at this point, Britain had something called the two-power standard, which was a rule that they had to make sure that they could defend their own nation as an island nation, but also to be able to defend their empire. And essentially, they had this rule that said that their navy had to be the biggest in the world, and it had to be so big that it was the size at least of the second biggest navy and the third biggest navy in the world combined. So in order for the Kaiser to build up his navy, he wanted to do it secretly, because if he didn't and he did it openly, Britain would also build up their navy as well, and so it would seem more pointless. So he did this in secret at first, after the advice of Alfred von Tirpitz. So the final question is, could Germany actually afford to build up their navy the way they did? The answer is no. This was really, really expensive. And in order to pass all these naval laws that you're going to look at next, he had to actually increase taxes and borrow loads of money. Now, before the First World War and even during it, the amount that they borrowed was 84% of what they spent. So it was absolutely enormous. They really couldn't afford to build up the Navy the way they did. And that's why they're in such a difficult position when it comes to things like the Treaty of Versailles in 1919 and the reparations, because they're already in debt. Even before the First World War started, they were in debt because of these naval laws. So for the last task, obviously we've got you to be introduced to the naval laws and answer some questions on them. This one's really simple. We just need you to make some notes on what the naval laws actually are. So you can see a table here where we have got the three main naval laws that we need to learn about. There were technically 5, but we only need to know about 3 of them. And all I want you to do is write down the date they were passed and what it did. You can do it as a table, or you can just put notes in your books, but just copy those down for me, please. So we've got the basic notes now about what the naval laws were. But what we need to think about now is how did they affect Britain, and how did they affect the relationship between Germany and Britain as well? Because if we're going to get to those grades 7, 8s and 9s, we need to think about the impact of policies as well as being able to describe what the policies were. So what I want you to do is to think about how do you reckon the relationship would have changed between Germany and Britain, and why do you think Britain would feel threatened by it? So just have a little think and jot down some ideas. Make sure you pause here because on the next slide I'm going to talk through what I would put for this. But do try and have a go on your own first. So I asked you to think about how would this change the relationship between Britain and Germany. Now, in terms of the answer, it changed it significantly. There was all of a sudden a lot of tension between Germany and Britain. Now, it led to something called the naval race, and this is the next thing I'm going to ask you to make some notes on. So once I've talked through this, I'd like you to put a new subheading of the naval race and then copy down the notes that are in this blue box. So we can see here different dates and different events that happened during the naval race. Let's talk through them before you do the notes. Now, first of all, the naval race started in 1900 when Britain realised what Germany were doing when they were trying to expand their empire and build up their navy. So Britain then started competing and building up their own navy again. Now things changed quite drastically in 1906 because of something called the dreadnought. Now the dreadnought you can see here is a type of battleship. It was a far superior battleship to anything that the Germans had. Now, when this was shown and when it was showcased for the first time with its powerful guns and its superior technology, the Germans were really jealous. And then they tried to copy it and they created their own version of the dreadnought. And after 1906, you can see it's not only a race to build battleships, but it becomes a race to build these really superior battleships of the dreadnoughts. Now, this event is really, really crucial, this naval race, because it really does lead to the First World War. It's not the spark, it's not the trigger, because you might remember from year 8 that that's about the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, the Austrian heir to the throne. But actually, it certainly creates this atmosphere of tension, and it creates this atmosphere where the British public support the idea of going to war against Germany. We can see here in 1908 that the British public protest and say, we want more battleships. We don't mind if our taxes are raised, if it means that we can defeat Germany and we can make sure that our navy's better than ours. So they do this public chant of, we want 8 and we won't wait. So they're actually saying we want 8 of these really expensive multi-million-pound battleships, and we think that it's worth the money. Now, in the end, Britain wins the race in the naval race with Germany because they have 29 dreadnoughts whilst Germany has 17. But that's not necessarily the important bit here. The important bit here is that basically it creates this enormous tension between both Germany and Britain. So in order to get top grades in history, we need to not only be able to describe different policies, but we need to be able to think about their impact. So what I'd like you to do now is to create a small table in your books. You definitely won't need a whole page for this, maybe half a page at most. And I want you to try and think about how would Weltpolitik cause World War I, and how would the naval laws cause World War I as well. Now it's important you do this as a table because you want to be able to add your own points, but then once you've completed it, you'll then go on to the next slide and see that I've added some more as well, and then you'll need to add to your tables. Okay, so thinking about how could this cause World War I? Have a go. What you need to do now is have a little look at these ideas. Some of them you'll probably already have and some of them might be new. And any that you're missing, you need to then add it to your own tables so that you've got these notes for revision. So let's first of all think about, how did Weltpolitik cause World War One? Now, first of all, we need to remember obviously what it is, and what it means is aggressive foreign policy. So essentially, we need to think about the fact that this made countries really nervous, and historians talk about how it upset the balance of power in Europe and caused international tension. And obviously, if countries started to become suspicious of each other, it means that they lose that trust, their relationships break down, and that's certainly what happened before the First World War. The second one is that the Kaiser actually said in a British newspaper that he wanted a place in the sun. Now that was seen as a direct threat to the British Empire, because remember there was that common saying of the sun never sets on the British Empire, and it seemed like the Kaiser was suggesting that he wanted to steal a piece of that. The third reason is that he competed with other European nations for parts of Africa, and that was quite aggressive, and he got really involved in other people's empires when he shouldn't have done. So for instance, at one point France wanted to take over Morocco, and the Kaiser basically meddled and got himself involved in it, and that really upset France. He also made it very clear that he wouldn't mind taking over Egypt, which Britain controlled at that point. So essentially, it kind of worried people what he was doing. They were worried that he was going to take over land that they wanted. Also, we've got to think about the fact that if there had never been any ambition to increase the size of his empire, he would never actually have then passed naval laws. So this policy of Weltpolitik is very, very important. And it led to all kinds of consequences, including the fact that previous enemies, Britain and France, were so threatened by Germany and their actions with Weltpolitik that they actually signed an alliance together in 1904, something called the Entente Cordiale. So Weltpolitik certainly did cause World War I to some extent. However, so did the naval laws. Now, the naval laws, obviously, first of all, were about him increasing the size of his navy. But this then made other countries nervous and led to the naval race. Now, we've already talked about on a couple of slides this idea of the two-power standard, and that's definitely worth mentioning as well. So Britain found this a real threat. As an island nation, they felt that Germany doing this was a direct threat to them, and it created that spirit of mistrust and competition, just like Weltpolitik did. Not only that, it again made the relationship between Britain and France stronger. It increased, their friendship at this point as well. Final written task for today, you need to decide which one of the following was more responsible in causing the outbreak of World War I. So, do you think it was the naval laws and the subsequent naval race, or do you think it was Weltpolitik, the Kaiser's aggressive foreign policy? So you need to write a paragraph explaining which one you think was more important in causing World War I, and you need to try and explain why. Now, don't forget you can use information from the previous slide in your table that you've got down in your books, and that you can't be wrong. So you just got to give your opinion and say, I think that, and then tell me which one was the most responsible in causing an outbreak of the First World War, and then tell me why you think that. So you want to use as much evidence as you can and really trying to convince your teacher why your argument is right. Once you've done it, you then need to submit it on Show My Homework or email it to your teacher, or you could use Teams. But remember, if you're submitting it on Teams, it's really important that you leave us a comment saying that you've done that, because otherwise we don't necessarily get a notification. So final written task, and once you've done that, you've just got the quiz to do, and then you're going to be finished. As always, there's going to be a quiz as the very final task for today, so make sure you go on to Show My Homework and complete the quiz. Now, you have to get 70% to be able to pass, as always, so if you don't get 70% on your first go, please do read over your notes again and then have a second go afterwards. People that get 100% will make sure that we're sending postcards home or telling your parents about your success.